It was the spring of 1843, and the great British engineer, Isambard Brunel, took a break from his work of building the SS Great Britain, the largest and most challenging ship ever to come off the drawing board to that time, to amuse his children with a magic trick. Things didn't go quite to plan, however. Midway through the entertainment, Brunel accidentally swallowed a gold coin that he was secretly hiding under his tongue. We can only imagine Brunel's look of surprise and perhaps light panic as he felt the coin slide down his throat and lodge at the base of his trachea. It wasn't the cause of any great pain, but it was uncomfortable and unnerving because he knew that if it shifted even slightly, it would choke him. Over the next few days, Brunel, his friends, colleagues, family, and doctors attempted every obvious remedy, from slapping him on the back to holding him upside down by his ankles and shaking him vigorously, but nothing worked. Seeking an engineered solution, Brunel designed a contraption from which he could hang upside down and swing in wide arcs in the hope that the motion and gravity together would make the coin fall out. But that didn't work either. Brunel's plight became the talk of the nation. Suggestions poured in from every corner of the country and from abroad, but every attempted remedy failed. Finally, on March 16th, more than 6 weeks after his ordeal began, Brunel got into his swinging contraption once again and set it in motion. Almost immediately, the coin fell out and rolled across the floor. Very shortly afterwards, the eminent historian Thomas Babington Macaulay burst into his club and shouted, "It's out!" and everyone knew what he meant. Brunel lived the rest of his life without any complications from the incident, and, as far as we know, never put a coin in his mouth again. We mention all this here to make a point, if it even needed making, that the mouth is a place of peril. Humans choke to death more easily than any other mammal, which is clearly not an attribute you want to go through life with or without a coin in your trachea. Look inside your mouth, and a good deal of what you find is familiar. Tongue, teeth, gums. But behind the scenes, as it were, are lots and lots of very important apparatus that most of us have never heard of. Palatoglossus, genioid, vallecula. As with every other part of your head, the mouth is a realm of complexity and mystery. The word that anatomists use for swallowing is deglutition, and that is something we do quite a lot, about 2,000 times a day, once every 30 seconds on average. Swallowing is a trickier business than you might think. Altogether, 50 muscles can be called into play just to get a piece of food from your lips to your stomach, and they must snap into attention in exactly the right order to ensure that whatever you dispatch into the alimentary canal doesn't go down the wrong way and end up lodged in your trachea like Brunel's coin. Uniquely in mammals, we send our food and air down the same tunnel. Only a small structure called the epiglottis, a kind of trapdoor for the throat, stands between us and catastrophe. The epiglottis opens when we breathe and closes when we swallow, sending food in one direction and air in another, but occasionally it errs, and the results are sometimes dire. It's pretty amazing when you reflect upon it that you can sit at a dinner party, enjoying yourself, eating, talking, laughing, breathing, and slurping wine, and that your nasopharyngeal guardians will send everything to the right place without you having to give it a moment's consideration. That's quite an accomplishment. Meanwhile, you, far from assisting this process, just keep pouring more wine down your throat, destabilizing all your internal systems and seriously compromising your brain's functional capabilities. When you consider the precision required and the number of times in a lifetime the systems are challenged, it is extraordinary that we don't choke more often. According to official sources, about 5,000 people in the United States choke on food each year. The well-known solution to a choking crisis is the Heimlich maneuver, named for Dr. Henry J. Heimlich, the surgeon from New York, who invented it in the 1970s. The Heimlich maneuver consists in embracing the choking victim from behind and giving them a series of sharp hugs to force out the blockage, like a cork from a bottle. Henry Heimlich was something of a showman. He promoted the procedure and himself relentlessly.
Here's Johnny.
Dr. Henry Heimlich is a noted surgeon and researcher who has developed a technique that I'm sure many of you are familiar with called the Heimlich maneuver. And he's going to show us how to do that tonight, which prevents a person who is choking from losing their life, a situation which has come up, and a lot of people will panic in that situation, not know what to do. So I think this is a very valuable experiment tonight. Would you welcome, please, Dr. Henry Heimlich. You want to start?
I thought I'd start with
Start
you.
on an actual human?
Well, no, with you.
Is the doctor in? No, come on in. Okay. Okay, I'm choking. What are you going to do now?
Okay, I'm going to put my arms around your waist.
Oh, yes.
Now, you make a fist. Now,
Right.
you take the thumb side of that fist, and you place it against the abdomen, just above the belly button,
Right.
and below the rib cage.
Right, below that floating rib.
Then, you press into
Right.
the abdomen with
Right.
a quick upward thrust.
Right.
That pushes the diaphragm up,
Right.
compresses the air, and blows the object away.
All right.
Now,
He appeared on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, sold posters and t-shirts, and talked to groups large and small across the country. He boasted that his method saved the lives of Ronald Reagan and several 100,000 others. Heimlich died in 2016, age 96, and shortly before his death, he saved the life of a woman at his nursing home with his own maneuver, the only time in his life that he had the opportunity to use it. Quietly and rhythmically, awake or asleep, generally without thought, every day you breathe in and out about 20,000 times, diligently processing some 4,000 gallons of air, depending on how big you are and how active. That's 7.3 million breaths between birthdays, 550 million or so over the course of a lifetime. Molecules come pouring in through the nostrils, and from there, air passes through a space in your head called the sinus cavity. Proportionate to the rest of your head, the sinuses take up an enormous amount of space, and no one is sure why. Whether or not they have a function, the sinuses cause a lot of unhappiness. 35 million Americans suffer sinusitis every year. Incidentally, the reason your nose runs in chilly weather is the same reason your bathroom window runs with water in chilly weather. In the case of your nose, warm air from the lungs meets the cold air coming into the nostrils and condenses, resulting in a drip. The lungs are also wonderfully good at cleaning. According to one estimate, the average urban dweller inhales some 20 billion foreign particles every day. Dust, industrial pollutants, pollen, fungal spores, and whatever is adrift that day. A lot of the stuff can make you very ill, but it doesn't, by and large, because your body is adept at challenging intruders. If the particles are big and irritating enough, you will almost certainly cough or sneeze it straight back out again. If it is too small to provoke such a vehement response, it will in all likelihood be trapped in the mucus that lies in your nasal passages or caught by the bronchi in your lungs. These airways are lined with millions of hair-like cilia that act like paddles. They push the invaders back into the throat, where they are diverted into the stomach and dissolve in hydrochloric acid. Despite all this, occasionally some pathogens get through and make you sick, but that's life. The formal name for the act of sneezing, by the way, is sternutation, though some authorities refer to a sneeze as an autosomal dominant, compelling helio-ophthalmic outburst, which makes the acronym ACHOO. Breathing is one of those few autonomic functions that you can control intentionally, though only up to a point. You can shut your eyes for as long as you wish, but you cannot shut off your breathing for long before the autonomic system reasserts itself and compels you to breathe. Interestingly, the comfort you feel when you hold your breath for too long is not caused by oxygen depletion, but by a buildup of carbon dioxide. That's why the first thing you do when you stop holding your breath is blow out. You would think that the most urgent need would be to get fresh air in rather than stale air out, but no. The body so abhors CO2 that you must expel it before any replenishment. Considering how complex an operation respiration is, it's not surprising that the lungs can cause a lot of problems. What is surprising is how little we sometimes understand the causes of these problems, and in no condition is that more true than asthma. If you were to nominate someone to be a poster figure for asthma, you could do worse than the great French novelist Marcel Proust. But then you could nominate Proust as a poster figure for a great many medical conditions because he had a superabundance of them. He suffered from insomnia, indigestion, backaches, headaches, fatigue, dizziness, and crippling depression. More than anything else, however, he was a slave to asthma. He had his first attack when he was 9 and passed a wretched life thereafter. Desperate to find a cure, he submitted to countless medical procedures, taking infusions of morphine, opium, caffeine, inhaling chloroform, and living as much of his life as he could in the fresh air mountain resorts. But nothing worked, and he died of pneumonia, his lungs all worn out, in the autumn of 1922, aged just 51. In Proust's day, asthma was a rare disease and not well understood. Today, it is common and still not understood. The second half of the 20th century saw a rapidly increased asthma rates in most Western nations, and no one knows why. An estimated 300 million people in the world have asthma today, and 5% of adults and about 50% of children. In China, for example, the city of Guangzhou is highly polluted, while nearby Hong Kong, just an hour away by train, is comparatively clean, as it has little industry and lots of fresh air since it's by the sea. Yet in clean Hong Kong, asthma rates are 50%, while in heavily polluted Guangzhou, it's 3%, exactly the opposite of what one would expect, and no one can account for any of this. Today, there is still no cure for asthma, which comes from the Greek word meaning to gasp. In an asthma attack, the airways narrow and the sufferer struggles to get air in or out. In people with milder forms of asthma, steroids are always effective at keeping attacks under control, but in people with more severe forms, steroids rarely work. And in 75% of young people, asthma resolves itself by the time they reach adulthood, but no one knows why this happens either, or why it doesn't happen to the unfortunate minority. Indeed, where asthma is concerned, no one knows much of anything. Another all too common affliction of the lungs deserves a mention, not so much because of what it does to us, but because of how extraordinarily long it took us to accept that it was doing it. I refer to smoking and lung cancer. It would seem almost impossible to ignore the link between the two. A person who smokes cigarettes regularly is 50 times more likely than a non-smoker to get cancer. In the 30 years between 1920 and 1950, which is when cigarette smoking took off in a big way in the world, the number of lung cancer cases soared. In America, they tripled. Similar increases were noted elsewhere, yet it took forever to get a consensus that smoking causes lung cancer. That may seem crazy to us today, but it wasn't so crazy to people back then. The problem was that huge proportions of people smoked, 80% of all men by the late 1940s, yet only some of them developed lung cancer. And some people who didn't smoke also developed lung cancer. So it was not especially straightforward to see a direct link between smoking and cancer. When lots of people are doing something and only some of them are dying from it, it makes it hard to impute blame to a single cause. Some people blamed air pollution for the rise of lung cancer. Others suspected the increased use of asphalt as a paving surface. One leading skeptic was Everett Ambrose Graham, a chest surgeon and professor at Washington University in St. Louis. Graham famously maintained that we might as plausibly blame lung cancer on the development of nylon stockings because they have become popular at the same time as smoking. But when a student of his, Ernst Winder, sought permission to conduct a study on smoking and cancer in the late 1940s, Graham gave him his consent, mostly in the expectation that it would disprove the theory of a link between smoking and cancer once and for all. In fact, Winder demonstrated conclusively that there was a link, so much so that Graham was persuaded by the evidence to change his mind. In 1950, the two men published a joint paper in the Journal of American Medical Association outlining a clear statistical link between smoking and lung cancer. Soon afterwards, the British Medical Journal ran a study with more or less identical findings by Richard Dole and Bradford Hill of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Although two of the world's most prestigious medical journals had now demonstrated a clear association between smoking and lung cancer, the findings had almost no effect. People just loved smoking too much to quit. Richard Dole in London and Everett Graham in St. Louis, both lifelong smokers, quit tobacco, but too late in the case of Graham. He died of lung cancer 7 years after his own report. Elsewhere, smoking just kept rising. The volume of smoking in the United States increased 20% in the late 1950s.
You know, this morning I got a call from our competitors at Brown and Williamson, and they're getting sued by the federal government because of the health claims they made.
Yeah, we're aware of that, Mr. Garner. But you have to realize that through manipulation of the mass media, the public is under the impression that your cigarettes are linked to certain fatal diseases.
Manipulation of the media? Hell, that's what I pay you for. Our product is fine. I smoke them myself.
My granddad smoked them. He died at 95 years old. He was hit by a truck.
I understand. But our hands are tied. We're no longer allowed to advertise that Lucky Strikes are safe.
So what the hell are we going to do? We've already funded our own tobacco research center to put this whole rumor to rest.
And that's a very good start. But it may not affect sales.
The Tobacco Industry Research Committee, a scientific panel paid for by the cigarette manufacturers, argued that although cancer from tobacco had been induced in laboratory mice, it had never been demonstrated in humans. No one has established that cigarette smoke or any one of its constituents was cancer-causing to man, wrote the panel's scientific director in 1957, conveniently overlooking that they could never be an ethical way to experimentally induce cancer in a living person. Spurred on by the tobacco industry, many commentators mocked the science, and governments took little interest in the question. When Britain's Minister of Health, Ian MacLeod, formally announced at a press conference that there was an unequivocal connection between smoking and lung cancer, he undercut his position by smoking as he did so. In 1964, the U.S. Surgeon General announced an unequivocal link between smoking and lung cancer, but the announcement had little effect. Remarkably, the American Medical Association took 15 years to endorse the Surgeon General's findings. Oh, how things have changed. Today, just 18% of Americans smoke, and it is easy to think that we have pretty much solved the problem. But it's not quite as simple as that. Nearly 1/3 of people below the poverty line still smoke, and the habit continues to account for 1/5 of all deaths. It is a problem we are a long way from rectifying. Finally, let us close on a common breathing affliction that is much less alarming most of the time, if no less mysterious. Hiccups. A hiccup is a sudden contraction of the diaphragm, which essentially startles the vocal cords into closing abruptly, making the famous hic sound. But no one knows why that happens. The world record for hiccups appears to have been held by a farmer in Iowa named Charles Osborne, who hiccuped continuously for 68 years. The hiccups began in 1922 when Osborne tried to lift a 350-pound hog for butchering and somehow triggered a hiccup response. At first, he hiccuped 40 times a minute. Eventually, that slowed down to 20 times a minute, and altogether he was estimated to have hiccuped 430 million times over nearly 7 decades. In the summer of 1990, a year before he died, Osborne's hiccups abruptly and mysteriously stopped. If you do get hiccups, and they don't go away spontaneously after a few minutes, medical science is at a loss to help you. The best remedies any doctor can suggest are the same ones you've known since you were a kid. Startling the victims by sneaking up and going boo, sipping ice water, pulling on their tongues, and at least a dozen others. Whether any of these age-old remedies actually work is not a matter medical science has addressed. More significantly, no one appears to keep figures on how many people suffer from chronic or sustained hiccuping, but the problem seems to not be trivial. So there you have it, the story of how we learnt about how our lungs and breath work, as well as the mysteries that's still around today. If you learned something you didn't know, be sure to leave a comment as to what that was and what you'd like to see next.